Welcome back to the deep dive. You asked us to unpack one of the most critical and really complex periods of the Second World War.
We're talking about just 3 months.
Just 3 months, July, August, and September of 1941.
And that short window of time, it basically defined the entire rest of the conflict.
It really did. It pivoted the war from what was, a primarily European struggle into this brutal global conflagration. You
Right.
suddenly have two massive simultaneous fronts opening up.
One in the East, one in the Pacific. It's the great inflection point.
So let's set the scene.
Okay, so in June of 41, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa,
The invasion of the Soviet Union.
the massive invasion. He is absolutely confident he can get a swift, overwhelming, a Blitzkrieg victory.
Before winter.
Exactly, before the Russian winter sets in. The sources we've looked at, they just show his supreme arrogance. He genuinely believed the Soviet regime was a house of cards just ready to topple over.
But of course, that collapse didn't happen.
Not at all.
And that stall, that grinding halt in the East, it had these immediate global reverberations. Because while Hitler's army is getting bogged down in the Russian steppes, his Japanese ally is making these crucial life-or-death strategic choices.
They're weighing everything up. They've got this costly, ongoing war in China.
Right.
And at the same time, they're facing mounting diplomatic pressure, crippling economic sanctions from the United States.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to synthesize these two converging crises.
We're looking at the sources that describe how the war in the East, which was fueled by Hitler's ideological hatred, directly influenced the timetable for the war in the Pacific.
Which was driven by Japan's desperate need for resources.
It's a direct link.
Right.
We're going to connect the failures of the German High Command to the countdown for the attack on Pearl Harbor and show you why, by the end of September 1941, global conflict was just, it was utterly unavoidable.
It's a deep dive into sheer geopolitical chaos. It's where we really see why Winston Churchill so famously captured the essence of the Soviet Union,
That great quote.
calling it a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And at the same time, we see how Japan's relentless drive for what they called self-preservation.
Pushed them into a war with a seemingly untouchable Western superpower.
Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
To really get a handle on the colossal strategic error Hitler made in June 1941, betraying that non-aggression pact from 1939, we have to establish the Soviet state's unique vulnerability at that time.
Right.
The seeds of the conflict go back centuries, but the immediate disaster of 1941, it feels like it was almost entirely due to internal self-sabotage.
Oh, absolutely. It was self-inflicted, a lot of it. For our deep dive, the historical context is pretty straightforward. You have Tsarist Russia under Nicholas II, which collapses during the staggering losses of World War I.
And that triggers the 1917 Russian Revolution.
Right. The working classes rise up. They establish the communist regime under Lenin. But then Lenin dies in 1924,
And Joseph Stalin takes control.
despite Lenin's explicit warnings about his brutality. There's that famous summary from Churchill about Lenin.
Oh, yes.
Their worst misfortune had been his birth.
Oh.
Well, the next worst was his death.
Exactly. And that transition to Stalin, it fundamentally changed the nature of the Soviet state and, crucially for our discussion, the character of the Red Army.
The contemporary reports we've analyzed, they paint this picture of Stalin's regime being just as brutal as Hitler's when it came to human rights.
The sources call this period the Great Purge, or maybe more accurately, the Great Terror. It starts in the 1930s, and this wasn't just about eliminating political dissent.
No.
This was about Stalin solidifying his absolute power. He purged any perceived opposition within the Communist Party, the intelligentsia, and, most critically for our topic, the military.
And the scale of this internal war against his own people is just staggering to read about.
It's almost unbelievable.
We're talking about forced collectivization that starved millions of people. Millions more ethnic minorities were deported, and anyone who dissented was sent to the forced labor camps, the notorious gulags. The rate of execution was relentless. Some estimates suggest around 1,000 Russians were executed a day.
1,000 a day.
And this terror was inflicted systemically. The goal was to ensure absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the regime. It hardened the entire national fiber for sure. The Red Army became a fierce fighting machine, but it came at the highest possible cost.
To its leadership.
To its leadership. When Operation Barbarossa hits in 1941, the Red Army is tactically brittle right at the very top.
Just how catastrophic was that loss of the command structure?
The Purge was utterly devastating. Let's look at the numbers. Of the 5 first marshals of the Soviet Union, that's the highest military rank, Only two survived Stalin's purge:
Only two.
Semyon Budyonny and Kliment Voroshilov. The rest were executed or imprisoned. It gets worse. 3 of the 5 first-rank army commanders were killed. 13 of the 15 second-rank commanders were killed.
Wow.
Just think of the institutional knowledge that was lost. The experience in large-scale maneuver warfare just vanished overnight.
So when Hitler struck, the Soviets were essentially decapitated at the command level.
Exactly. Their generals were either incredibly cautious, terrified of making a mistake that would lead to their own execution,
Or they were simply too inexperienced to handle a modern massive invasion like the Blitzkrieg.
and that weakness, that's the opening Hitler was banking on.
It is. And this brings us back to that strange geopolitical maneuver of 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right. Hitler's hatred for communism was, it was venomous.
Absolutely core to his ideology.
Yet he strikes a deal with Stalin. Why?
He needed insurance.
Precisely. The pact, signed in August 1939, was a temporary convenience. It included secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into defined German and Soviet spheres of influence.
Most famously, the partitioning of Poland.
Yes, this ensured that when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, he avoided his ultimate nightmare, a two-front war.
And both sides knew the pact was based on mutual distrust, right?
Oh, completely. But Stalin genuinely believed it gave him time. Time to rearm, time to rebuild his purged military structure.
Which is why, when Hitler launched Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviets were completely surprised.
Utterly blindsided. And this is despite Allied intelligence sending repeated explicit warnings of an imminent invasion.
Stalin's own paranoia and his commitment to the pact led him to ignore all the signs. He just assumed Hitler would never strike so soon, not while Britain remained unconquered.
That was the fatal miscalculation. The German invasion opened up the single largest military theater in world history. It demanded almost every single German resource.
And that enormous commitment of Axis resources on the Eastern Front is precisely what signaled opportunity or, danger to their ally in the Pacific.
So Japan.
Okay, let's pivot to the Pacific then. With Germany now fully engaged in this brutal war in the East, how did that commitment of resources signal opportunity to the Imperial Japanese government?
For Japan, the war in Europe, and specifically the attack on Russia, it created a vacuum of power.
A huge one.
But to understand why Japan was so eager to fill that vacuum, you have to look at their deep-seated resentment toward the West. Japan was, this nation of great mystery for centuries.
Isolated.
Until the mid-19th century. Commodore Matthew Perry of the American Navy effectively forces trade links open. And Japan viewed this as a national humiliation, as exploitation.
And as the 20th century dawned, American dominance in the Pacific just became undeniable.
Yes, absolutely. The U.S. acquired Alaska from Russia, they took the Philippines and Guam from Spain, and they annexed Hawaii.
Establishing massive forward naval bases.
Right in their backyard. Japan, seeing itself as being boxed in, dramatically modernized its military. They modeled their army on the French and Prussians and their navy on the British. They were determined to establish themselves as the dominant regional power.
And their first major demonstration of this new power, it came against Russia, funnily enough.
The Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Japan saw Korea as a vital safety buffer against continental powers. And they won this stunning victory over the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. It cemented their regional status.
But this military ambition quickly ran up against international constraints after World War I.
It did. You're referring to the Washington Naval Treaty.
Yes. Tell us about how this treaty specifically limited Japan and why they felt so targeted by the Western powers.
Okay, so the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty was designed to prevent a costly arms race. It limited the tonnage of capital ships, so battleships and aircraft carriers, for the 5 major naval powers.
And there was a ratio.
A very specific one. The ratio was 5.5, 0.3, 0.1, 0.75, 0.1, 0.75. That's 5 units for the U.S., 5 for Britain, and only 3 for Japan.
And France and Italy with even less.
Right. But Japan felt this 5.5, 0.3 ratio was deliberately discriminatory. It was designed to permanently cap their ability to defend their regional interests against the wealthier, more established powers.
So you have strategic constraint fueling resentment, and then economic desperation comes along and fuels aggression.
Absolutely. The Wall Street crash of 1929 devastated the global economy. As an island nation, poor in natural resources, Japan relied heavily on imports for everything.
Prince Fumimaro Kono, who would become prime minister, he really articulated this desperation.
He did. He believed the Western nations were hoarding resources, protecting their own self-interests. He said, and this is a key quote, that unless every country had equal access to raw materials, Japan would have no resort but to destroy the status quo for the sake of self-preservation.
Chilling words.
Very. And the military's answer to this resource trap was immediate action.
The invasion of Manchuria in 1931.
Manchuria, in northeastern China, was rich in coal, iron, gold. The Imperial Army, which was largely operating independently of the civilian government by this point,
A key detail.
they seized the region, renamed it Manchukuo, and installed the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as a puppet ruler.
And they set about exploiting it ruthlessly.
Beyond ruthlessly, they settled 5 million Japanese colonists, began aggressive mining, and, maybe most shockingly, they massively subsidized the growth of opium poppies.
Get this, the profits from this drug trade directly funded the Imperial Army.
It created this perverse economic cycle that resulted in a quarter of Manchukuo's population becoming opium addicts. It was cynical and brutal.
And when the League of Nations refused to recognize this puppet state, the Japanese response was just pure defiance.
Oh, yeah. In February 1933, the delegate Yusuke Matsuoka famously declared that Manchuria was a matter of life or death for Japan.
And then he just walks out.
He leads the entire Japanese delegation in a dramatic walkout, withdrawing Japan permanently from the League. Their isolation was now self-imposed.
And this aggressive, military-dictated policy, it just escalates. It leads to full-scale war with China in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident.
The sources are really clear here. This is the period where the military, led by hardliners like Hideki Tojo, completely bypasses the authority of the civilian government. Even Prime Minister Kono admitted he had little control over them.
And the horrors that followed, like the Nanjing Massacre, that just signaled Japan's utter disregard for any kind of international opinion.
Indeed. And it was American outrage over incidents like the bombing of the gunboat USS Panay in 1937, which killed 3 Americans, that really solidified American suspicion of Japan's true intentions.
Roosevelt accepted their apology, but the damage was done.
He accepted it, but he started tightening the screws, which culminated in the 1939 embargo on aircraft sales. The conflict was simmering.
But the critical factor, the thing that cemented Japan's commitment to the Pacific, rather than joining Hitler against Russia, happened in 1939, far away in Mongolia.
The Battle of Khalkhin Gol. This is such a crucial, often overlooked geopolitical pivot.
It really is.
Japan regarded Russia as its traditional hereditary enemy. Many in the Imperial Army, the North Strike Group, favored marching into Siberia. And this border dispute between Japanese-controlled Manchuria and Soviet-backed Mongolia brought this rivalry to a head at the Khalkhin Gol River.
So tell us about the Soviet response there. What happened?
The Japanese crossed the river, and they were met by this massive Soviet counterforce. And it was led by an energetic, tough commander named Georgy Zhukov.
A survivor of the Purge.
A survivor of the Purge who was rapidly making a name for himself. What's vital here is Zhukov's innovative tactics. Unlike the Japanese, who still relied heavily on infantry and, traditional strategy,
Zhukov was using something new.
he was using deep strike operations, a truly modern, combined arms approach.
What specifically made his strategy so devastating to the Japanese?
Zhukov used his armored units and motorized infantry, his tanks and artillery divisions, not just as simple support units, he used them as a hammer and an anvil. In August 1939, he launched this overwhelming surprise counterattack.
And it encircled them.
It completely encircled and annihilated the Japanese Northern Task Force. This wasn't just a defeat for Japan, it was a profound military humiliation. They suffered catastrophic losses in men and equipment.
And the sources are clear. This single disaster permanently changed Japanese foreign policy.
It did. The sheer scale of the defeat convinced the Imperial General Staff that the Soviet military machine was too strong, too robust, and, thanks to Zhukov's genius, too well led to challenge successfully.
So they abandoned the North Strike.
Forever. Their entire focus shifted to the South Strike, targeting the resource-rich, but what they saw as weakly defended, colonial territories of the British, Dutch, and Americans in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific.
So that small battle in Mongolia effectively saved the Soviet Union from the disaster of a simultaneous two-front war in 1941.
It absolutely did. It's one of history's great what-ifs.
Okay, so Japan is now looking south, calculating that the Western powers are distracted. Meanwhile, that European war, the invasion of the Soviet Union Barbarossa, is in full swing. Let's look closely at why, just weeks into the invasion, the German advance faltered.
When Barbarossa began, the German strategy was meticulous. It was well-planned, but it was fundamentally flawed by Hitler's self-belief.
Is it arrogance again?
His arrogance. The goal was to reach the Urals and the Volga River before the winter. The three army groups had these critical, massive objectives, and the speed of the initial attack, it seemed unstoppable.
Let's just quickly review those objectives because they define the later strategic debate.
Okay, so Army Group North, under von Lied, was tasked with marching through the Baltics to take or destroy Leningrad.
The symbolic birthplace of the revolution.
And you had Army Group South, under von Rundstedt. Their job was to secure the Ukraine, the agricultural heartland, and then push east to the oil-rich Caucasus region.
The fuel reserves Hitler desperately needed.
The crucial fuel. And finally, Army Group Center, under von Bock, had the most vital objective of all.
Moscow.
Taking Moscow. The capital, the industrial base, and the command hub of the entire Soviet railway network.
And the initial success was terrifyingly swift. 3 million Axis troops just shattered the Soviet defense lines.
They were advancing over 20 miles a day in some places. It was an operational masterpiece at first. Army Group Center quickly encircled Minsk, and by mid-July they had Smolensk in their sights. The path to Moscow was open.
But even as this triumph was unfolding, the seeds of failure were being sown by logistics.
The panzers, the fast-moving tank divisions, were simply outpacing their supply lines, and they were outpacing the slower infantry that was meant to mop up pockets of resistance.
Which created the first major tactical failure right there at Smolensk.
Exactly. The panzers created these huge encirclements, but the crucial pincers, the infantry columns bringing up the rear, they failed to close quickly enough.
And thousands of Soviet soldiers escaped.
Thousands of them, though disorganized, managed to slip through the trap. This meant the German forces were expending more resources and more time hunting down these scattered pockets of resistance than they should have been.
And this tactical strain was then made 10 times worse by the strategic disagreement at the top. This finally boils over in July 1941. We have to talk about Directive 33.
Yes, the German High Command, Bock, Guderian, all of them, they knew that Moscow was the key.
Yeah.
Militarily, logistically, it had to fall before the weather turned.
But Hitler had other ideas.
Hitler prioritized ideology and resources over strategy. He issued Directive 33 on July 19th, and it codified his belief that the ultimate military goal was Leningrad first, the Donetsk Basin second, and Moscow third.
Talk us through the reasoning behind such a radical, non-traditional military move. Why?
It's a combination of ideological hatred and resource obsession. First, Leningrad. It used to be St. Petersburg. It was the cradle of Bolshevism. For Hitler, destroying it held this immense ideological weight. Second, the Caucasus oil fields. They were absolutely essential for sustaining the Wehrmacht's mechanized army for a long war. Hitler believed capturing Moscow, while symbolically important, wouldn't win the war if he ran out of fuel.
So he wanted the oil and the rich agricultural lands of the Ukraine immediately.
Immediately. He saw Moscow as a prestige target, but not the decisive one.
And the sources revealed that the German Army High Command they were absolutely dismayed.
The internal friction was intense. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the tank genius, they openly argued with Hitler. They insisted Moscow had to be the priority.
Guderian warned him, didn't he?
He warned him that halting the advance and turning south would expose their forces to the coming winter, and it would give the Soviets invaluable time to reorganize, to regroup, to bring up fresh reserves from the Siberian territories.
But Hitler, viewing himself as the strategic genius who had conquered France, he just overruled them all.
He wouldn't listen.
So Directive 33 meant key panzer units from Army Group Center. The very forces aimed at Moscow were diverted. Some south to assist Rundstedt in the Ukraine, and some north toward Leningrad. How much time did this debate and this diversion actually cost them?
They lost critical time, roughly from mid-July to mid-August, and that was the most favorable summer weather for the advance. That month, that delay, born of Hitler's arrogance, effectively doomed the entire plan.
And while the Germans were arguing amongst themselves, Stalin, having finally emerged from his paralysis, he starts appealing to Russian nationalism.
The Great Patriotic War.
And he's frantically asking Churchill for help.
He was. He urgently requested Britain open a second front by attacking German forces occupying France. But Churchill was stretched thin.
Incredibly thin.
He's fighting Rommel in North Africa, he's defending the Atlantic supply routes, and now he's facing this immense worry over the Japanese threat to Pacific colonies like Singapore and Hong Kong. He just couldn't do it.
And the sheer military cost of Directive 33 becomes crystal clear in September with the fall of Kiev.
The diverted Central Forces ensured Rundstedt's success there. Kiev fell on September 19th. The encirclement was devastating. 4 entire Soviet armies were surrounded.
And the numbers are just horrific.
German records claim they captured 600,000 Soviet troops, the
600,000.
largest encirclement of troops in military history. This depleted the Red Army's strength in the south massively.
And the treatment of these captured soldiers was particularly brutal.
Hitler's ideological war meant he refused to adhere to international laws on prisoners of war. He considered Slavs a subhuman race.
So these captured Soviets were just.
They were subjected to starvation, summary executions, or sent to concentration camps like Buchenwald, where they were often used for horrific human experimentation. The cruelty set the tone for the entire Eastern Front.
And at the same time, in the north, the Siege of Leningrad begins. A story of unimaginable suffering that would last over 2 years.
By the end of August, Army Group North, supplemented by those diverted central tanks, was within 30 miles of Leningrad. The Finnish army had retaken their lost territories to the north, closing the circle.
Though the Finns refused to press the attack on the city itself.
That's right. But Hitler didn't want the city captured. He wanted it obliterated. On September 22nd, he formally ordered Leningrad to be erased from the face of the earth.
The horror stemmed from the complete lack of planning and the deliberate German intent to starve the entire population.
Precisely. No adequate evacuation plan was in place, trapping millions of civilians. German forces cut off all supply routes, road, rail, everything.
And the siege lasted for
An agonizing 872 days. From September 41 until January to 44, over 1 million people died. Food rationing collapsed almost immediately.
And the stories from the siege are
Unspeakable. People were eating sawdust, leather, glue. In documented cases, they resorted to cannibalism just to survive the freezing, relentless blockade. The human cost of Hitler's ideological priority was total.
While the fate of millions was being decided in the frozen fields of the USSR, events in the Pacific went from tense negotiations to outright crisis.
Japan saw the deep German commitment in Russia, and they moved swiftly to exploit that geopolitical instability.
Right. First, we need to address the tripartite pact shock. Japan, Germany, and Italy had signed this pact in 1940, creating the Axis alliance.
Yet when Hitler invaded the USSR in June 1941, he gave his ally, Japan, zero warning.
Why was that secrecy such a betrayal to the Japanese?
It put them in a devastatingly awkward position. Their foreign minister, Yosuke Matsuoka, had just signed a neutrality pact with Stalin in April of 41.
Right.
Suddenly, their major ally is demanding they join a war against the very nation they had just promised peace to. Matsuoka himself was so ideologically committed he actually urged for war with Russia from the east to align fully with Hitler.
But the Japanese government was very wary of this proposal.
Especially after the humiliation of Khalkhin Gol. So to manage the diplomatic fallout and neutralize Matsuoka's dangerous pro-Russian war stance, Prime Minister Konoe took this drastic step. He resigned his entire cabinet in July 1941.
Only to reform a new government immediately.
Immediately afterward, without Matsuoka. This maneuver signaled that Japan would not join Hitler's war on the USSR. They would remain focused on their own strategic priorities.
The South Strike.
The South Strike. And that meant aggressive expansion into territories rich in raw materials like oil, rubber, and tin. The government justified this expansion with the propaganda of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
The propaganda claimed Japan was liberating Asian peoples from Western imperialism.
From the British, the Dutch, the French, the reality was pure military expansionism fueled by resource need. The sources confirmed the first major target, French Indochina,
modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos,
which was administered by the pro-Axis Vichy regime in France, making it an easy target.
And U.S. intelligence confirmed these preparations for a southward advance.
By July 1941, Japan had occupied key air bases in southern Indochina. This was the final straw for the Americans.
Why?
Because it placed the Japanese within easy striking distance of the American-held Philippines, the British colonies of Malaya and Singapore, and most importantly, the Dutch East Indies.
Indonesia, the world's largest source of oil outside of the Americas.
Right. Roosevelt's response was immediate, and it was economic. The ultimate pressure point was applied on August 1st, 1941.
This was the economic hammer blow.
Roosevelt placed an immediate and total embargo on the sale of oil and steel to Japan. Britain and the Dutch East Indies swiftly followed suit, and this was devastating.
Because Japan was almost entirely dependent on the West for its strategic raw materials, especially oil.
The Japanese war machine simply could not run without it.
And what were the immediate consequences of this economic siege?
The Japanese military did the math. They calculated that they had only enough stored oil for 2 years of conflict. This wasn't a shortage, it was a deadline.
And the embargo was coupled with a tough ultimatum from the U.S.
Withdraw entirely from China and Indochina and renounce your treaty with the Axis powers.
The chief of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff, Osami Nagano, he realized the gravity of the situation. This was the moment the decision for war became inevitable, wasn't it?
For the military leadership, yes. Nagano concluded that Japan was being strangled by iron fists. They faced a choice. Either submit to the American ultimatum and accept national humiliation and stagnation, or fight.
Fight to break the embargo before their oil reserves ran dry.
They decided they must fight, and they must strike quickly and decisively before the American fleet could fully mobilize.
And this countdown was happening at the same time as that famous meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill in Newfoundland.
The meeting aboard the Prince of Wales on August 9th, that's where they drafted the Atlantic Charter. An idealistic document advocating for global economic cooperation, self-determination post-war. The Western world saw it as a statement of democratic intent.
But the Japanese government interpreted it very differently.
They saw it as a declaration of intent for global domination.
A blueprint for Anglo-American world domination.
Precisely. They saw the U.S. and Britain cementing their alliance and their control over the world's resources, leaving Japan permanently constrained. And this perception, it just hardened their resolve for war.
And so the deadline was set internally.
An imperial conference convened on September 6, 1941. The conclusion was stark. If negotiations did not resolve the crippling oil supply issues, which they knew was highly unlikely given the American ultimatum, hostilities against the U.S., the Netherlands, and Great Britain would commence by mid-October.
The countdown was now official.
And the preparation for the initial attack was accelerated.
The attack plan itself was drafted by Admiral Yamamoto, who had previously and famously urged for peace with America. That fact alone speaks volumes about the desperation of the situation.
Yamamoto was a brilliant strategist. He had studied in America, and he understood its vast industrial capacity. He knew Japan could not win a long war against the U.S.
So his conclusion was ruthless.
The only path to success was a crippling, preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could reach the Far East. The plan for Pearl Harbor was being perfected using spy intelligence flowing back from Hawaii. Japan was now fully committed to a war. It knew it had to finish quickly, all driven by that 2-year fuel timeline.
And if we look back to the Eastern Front, by the end of September 1941, Hitler, finally listening to his frustrated generals, issues the order for the full advance on Moscow.
Operation Typhoon.
But the wasted time, those weeks spent diverting forces for Directive 33, had cost him the critical month he needed to take the city.
Before the mud and snow arrived.
Meanwhile, the Japanese deadline was rapidly approaching, guaranteeing that the global war would explode simultaneously in 2 theaters before the winter of 1941 was even out.
A perfect storm.
That deep dive into the summer of 1941 clearly shows that history doesn't happen in isolation. The fate of the Soviet Union was, in a way, saved by a Mongolian battle in 1939 that shifted Japanese focus.
And the massive casualties inflicted in the Ukraine and at Leningrad were the direct result of Hitler's ideological arrogance, codified in Directive 33, which wasted those vital weeks of campaigning time.
Right. And conversely, the path to Pearl Harbor was paved by economic necessity.
The crippling oil and steel embargo was the final, non-negotiable trigger point for Japan. They concluded they had 2 years of fuel left and had to choose between immediate war and national collapse.
And that choice meant war against the United States.
What's fascinating here is how the world stage was set not just by grand military designs, but by these internal anxieties and strategic blunders.
Stalin's purges weakened the Soviet defenses, but Zhukov's tactical genius saved them from a 2-front war.
Knudsen's resource desperation fueled the South Strike, and ultimately Hitler's fatal obsession with ideology over logistical strategy cost him the chance to capture Moscow in 1941.
So the winter of 1941 was the simultaneous launch of 2 massive interconnected phases of the war.
The grinding, ideological war of annihilation in the East and the sudden, resource-driven war across the vastness of the Pacific.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If Hitler had actually listened to his generals and captured Moscow in August, achieving a decisive victory against the USSR, would Japan still have chosen the dangerous South Strike strategy?
Or would a Soviet collapse have reopened the option for a joint Axis attack on Siberia?
Completely changing the alignment of the United States in the conflict. It's something to mull over as you consider the critical nature of these 3 months.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the converging crises of the Second World War. If you enjoyed understanding these complex historical moments and want to support the creation of more in-depth historical analysis, be sure to check out my shop link in the description and purchase some of the official War Stories merch. Your support helps keep this history alive. We'll see you next time.